Good evening, everybody. Scott Stevens here with another perspective, our bi-weekly or twice weekly show where I kind of talk about some of the things that are important to me. They've been important to me at some point in my life, and obviously or apparently they're relevant today for some reason because they're either in the news or they will be in the news in the very near future. So it's something I want to address. Last week at this time, we talked about time travel. That's an interesting topic. And then more recently, we've been talking about some of the crises that we've been having in the world. And what I wanted to really get into was, there we are, right there, that we really kind of all wanted the same thing. That's what I addressed on Monday, how there's this commonality, this need that we all have, and that politics, at least the way the right and the left system has been set up, just doesn't allow for a coming together, a unity of purpose, a vision for the nation. Rather, it's a vision of one side versus the other, and then we're constantly battling on what ground to give up or surrender to the other side rather than doing that which is best for everyone. And this is really what I'm struggling with, is how we can find topics to where the right and left can come together, we can agree to, and we can make some progress. Because if we're dealing or want to stay dealing with those issues which have been political items in the past, division will not be overcome. It just will not be possible because we're gonna dig our feet in and never surrender, never give into the other side. And it's kind of curious when you look at where Congress is today versus where it was, say, 40, 60 years ago, where right now, how many topics could we kind of agree upon? And back then there was this overlapping where this part of the party or this part of the party and leaving the outsides kind of on the outside, and they would vote no either way, but there was a consensus. And that seems to be nearly impossible, to where even in the previous administration, executive orders were the way things got done. And once those powers were given into the executive branch, now this president is using them. He is using nothing that wasn't already gifted to that office or surrendered to that office by the previous two. So yes, Karen, it is polarizing. So I want to talk about food security. We all eat. We all have to eat. There's no way around this. And we all have our pasts. We have all, at one point or another, I can't say all, but many of us have had times where we've had crisis in income, where the opportunity to eat as much or have as much on the table simply was not there. So that's where we'll start today, is with global insecurity with food. And you would think that this is something that would just be obvious, that every child born has the right to a meal. And there has been a part of the welfare system where when the kid goes to school, the child goes to school, they can eat. And right now, as we're finding, as schools have been let out because of COVID, that these children were not getting fed, that truly was their only meal. And at that most important time of their life where they're growing, they're developing, the systems are wiring, and they're not getting fed. And then the other part of this is, what kind of food are they being fed? So I grew up in a household where food security was always an issue. My father was a school teacher and he was a coach. And with that level of income, we all had to pitch in on the land that we ended up getting when we moved to Idaho, left New Mexico and moved to Idaho, that we ended up with like an acre and a half. And that was enough to feed us. And there I am, on the right. And I was maybe 10 and a half, 11 years old. But we all had to pitch in to work. We all had chores. Even at this age, we had chores. And we had to supplement his paycheck with our own homegrown food. Most of our rural neighbors were farmers, and that helped a lot when times occasionally got lean. And we were fortunate enough to have our neighbors as farmers and also members of the church that we were in. And we ended up, on occasion, getting a calf from them so we could be and sustain ourselves. And as we kind of got our feet underneath us, the pens grew, the containers grew upon which we grew our food. We ended up with chickens and turkeys. And the fun of it all was the discovering which eggs would be in the coop, both morning and evening, because you had to check them twice. If you left the eggs too long, either you wouldn't get them the next day, or the chickens would actually peck at the other chickens' eggs, because they wanted their own eggs in there. Well, the one thing was certain was that we had to get through the roosters. to get to the eggs. And we all had our share to do. We all had a set list of chores, and we all had to support each other, even as kids. If someone wasn't feeling well or somebody had practice, we had to pick up and do those chores. That's just the way it was. And the cats were an important part of keeping the mice out of the hen house. They had their work to do, and so the hens on occasion would get out and, share the goodies. And we all knew how important it was for our pantry to fill it up before summer ended. Being raised Mormon, we were consistently admonished to have 1 year's supply of food on hand. That was the goal. When we had corn in the garden, we needed to be able to freeze enough or can enough to last until the next harvest. 12 months. And whether it was potatoes, whether it was broccoli, and we had a big freezer, and that was always full by the time we got to August, and certainly by September. But we are admonished to have 1 year's supply of food on hand for when that time arrives. So I'm asking, has that time finally arrived? This was the strawberry patch we put in the first year we built the house, 1977, and it takes 3 years to get the canes mature. The second year, the cane will eventually fruit, and then the next year, that one's got to be cut out to make room for the next one. So it's a 2-year crop cycle on raspberries. And if it's ripe, it has to be harvested. These were raspberries that were just 3 years old. The canes produce just once and have to be cut out to make room for that new growth. Raspberries, I learned, taste best when they're harvested in the morning, so it was always up and at 'em. We grew everything we could in the cool eastern Idaho climate, where often we had to protect the susceptible plants from late August frosts. We were always fighting those early frosts. We only had pigs because I won one in a greased pig contest at the county fair. We didn't have a pig pen ready to go that particular afternoon, so we had to assemble one rather quickly. So the stinky guy that had lard all over his body and pig poop, that never came out of my clothes. That outfit literally went through the wash 4 or 5 times. I had to throw it away because I could never wear it from that point on. But also from that point on, we would then use family leftover food to be sent out to the pig pen. Americans waste 40% of all the food. 40% ends up going in the trash, in the waste. It is just waste. So our eyes as Americans, and probably a lot of other cultures, eat almost as much food as our stomachs can, and the rest just goes to the pig pen in an ideal case. All are not so fortunate. Food security is a measure of available food and individuals' ability to access it. Affordability is just one factor. There's evidence of food security being a concern even many thousands of years ago, with central authorities in China and ancient Egypt being known to release food from food storage in times of famine. They knew everything was a cycle. If you had 4 good years, you might have 2 or 3 after that were hard times. So they obviously stored foods so that you didn't end up overthrowing the king. You didn't overthrow the rulers when everyone else were to get hungry, because when they're hungry, people do things that they wouldn't do in other times. So it was just common knowledge. It was common practice. It was smart to have food set aside. In the 1974 World Food Conference, the term food security was defined with an emphasis on supply. Food security is defined as availability at all times of adequate, nourishing, diverse, balanced, moderate world food supplies and basic foodstuffs to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption and to offset fluctuations in production and prices. That's the big thing, our food fluctuations in prices, because prices obviously follow supply. Supply gets short, prices go up. It's not like your income. The paycheck varies as well. No, the income is also largely set. It's not going to vary much year to year to year. All you can do is supplement your supplies of food or send the spouse out into the workforce if they're not already. All right, the issues I see at hand. Good to see you on board, Shane. It's been a bit since I've seen you. What I'm seeing as the issues that we're going to have to rectify. I don't know that there are answers for all of them, but we absolutely have issues, and that is factory farming. We're missing plant diversity. Everything has been shifted to being Roundup ready. And what that does is it offers or puts the farmers in the position of highest risk. Highest risk for success means great rewards. But that also means more supply, which then suppresses the prices on the market. But then also, if you have a famine, a bug, something, then you're also at highest risk for failure because you have no diversity. So then all decisions at this massive factory farming scale are ROI based, return on investment, and not necessarily what is best in the long term, say for the children, say even for next year, but just the check that you'll get at the end of harvest. And families have become largely contract labor. Tyson comes in, offers them to grow chicken. The farmer says, we can do this. We can deliver this amount of meat on this particular day using Tyson's food supplies. So the farmers are really nothing much more than just contract labor. And then the financialized marketplace, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which then determines almost globally the prices of these products that the farmers are going through, they're going to produce. And you can't negotiate because you've got a great crop. No, you've got to take the given price that comes down from above. We've developed chemical dependencies for fertilizers, herbicides, GMO seeds developed to deal with the chemical dependencies. And of course, it all comes down to petroleum fuel and then also based as fertilizers. And you do this long enough, and we're going to be subjecting our soil's health to constantly being worn down. Glyphosate, petroleum salt buildups, escalating water requirements to deal with that salt buildup in the soils. And then that also impacts food selection diversity, limited or limiting our nutritional options, and the loss of generational wisdom. This is a really big one that is tough to gauge in economic value. The ability for the farmer simply to save seeds from their own crops, then licensing lives and corporation, the ability to license the life that they have created and develop patents on adjustments to genetics, and of course climate issues, temperatures and climate either up or down, and then more recently irregular precipitation patterns, and then investment in infrastructure like greenhouses, irrigation, and soil remediation to deal with the what ifs. And then there's bees pollinating and all the other insects and vulnerable small life onto the monoculture. So we're dealing with an increase in population. That just is the way it is. A reduction per capita land availability or arable usable land per person. Wastage of food, we hit that. 40% of Americans waste what's there. Imagine 40%. And a change in eating habits as we're just force-fed that which is put in front of us or put in the grocery store aisles. Crop failures to extreme weather, grain used as livestock feed. This is a whole other issue, a whole other series of shows that could be done on livestock and how to properly feed them. So where we end up in 2020 is kind of a precarious place. The first food issue that appeared at least on my radar and my news scanning was the plague of locusts across Africa, and as it spread into the Middle East. The locust, pestilence, and famine. A lot of water came in with cyclones onto the Arabian Peninsula, soaked them in May of 18, October of 18, October of 19, and that really set the stage for a greening of that part of the world, of the Arabian Peninsula, and that allowed for those eggs to hatch, and then those locusts to begin the reproduction cycle, and then the rains continued, and they spread through Arabia, they spread through Somalia, they spread through Kenya, they spread through Ethiopia, and the movement has continued because this graphic really hasn't gotten much past February of this year. And as the locusts spread, they're locusts. They ate everything in sight, and what they did behind was lay eggs. And now they've even spread from Pakistan and India into Western China, where the Chinese, instead of sending the kids out into the field to try to get them to move along, have deployed ducks. And they even sent ducks to Pakistan. They developed drones and loaded up herbicide or pesticides, I suppose would be the right side, that they used to fly out through these swarms. But is it enough? Is it enough? And on top of that, COVID shows up. Immediately, those that are preppers, those that are waiting for that time, saw what was coming and went to the store shelves and grabbed what they could assessed what their pantries had or didn't have, and then we began to see breakdowns in supplies, suppliers of input. This is an incredibly complex system where we used to have the inputs. A lot of that sat with the farmers alone. They kept their seeds from last year. They had cattle to then fertilize, and they had the carriages, the horses to take their food, their farm to table, farm to table. It was very, very quick. The supply chain was small. We didn't necessarily have processors. The milk was raw. It was left on the consumer's doorsteps, and that was the end of it. They go back, pick up the milk bottle, back to the farm, wash it, clean it, and send it back out again. We only had 3 steps in this process, and now we've got processors to wholesalers to retailers and finally out to consumers. So the strings of this food supply chain have grown long. They have grown complex. This is a problem. And now with COVID in place, you have a high-density work location dealing with meats in cool, moist locations. You've got to keep the air moving, and then we can have a further spread of COVID. The other issue is if you're dealing with community spread, as we've all learned, on lockdown, people don't go out for the French fries. They don't go to the drive-thru. They don't have that bloomin' onion. They're not eating like they used to. The food ends up not going to the grocery store that went to the restaurants can't go to the grocery stores because it's different distribution systems. So the farmers in this particular case, Idaho, my home, ended up just dumping potatoes today because we have no home for them because of this COVID-19 disaster. The potato supply chain has definitely been turned upside down. If you like a few bags, come on by, and the address in Oakley is given. That happened. People showed up. They brought their boxes. They boxed them up and then shared them. And this is going to be the solution. We have to shorten the supply chains because we don't know when the next COVID, when the next disaster is going to happen. Heavy rains began in China in early June and continue to this day. Flooding has been ongoing since the 3rd week of June, rains beginning a little bit earlier than that. And even as drought holds grip over northwestern China, greatly impacting their own grain harvest. What was not lost by drought was then lost by flood. Rice is planted in 3 seasons: March, April, May and June, and July and August. The floods across June and July impacted all 3 of those planting opportunities for the Chinese and others in that location. So they've lost out all 3 crops. The first one was flooded out as it approached harvest. The second one, too wet to plant. And the third one would be too late to harvest if it were to go in now. So 1 ton of rice holds 19 million calories versus 1 ton of wheat at 4 million calories. So you can see that there's a massive caloric displace for just those cereal grains. So the flooding happens in China, but it's not the news. It's not the news. We hear about it on occasion, but most likely from social media than rather being front and center in the news. And because of that, we're not understanding the complexities of the supply chain and truly the quantity and the breadth of industries that are now isolated in this one country, in China, and literally in this one valley where the flooding is greatest. And it started just as overflows of rivers and creeks, and then it began to rise and rise a little more. Smaller local gardens in the cities began to get flooded. And then it spread farther and farther out as more and more hectares of acreage went underwater, not for a day, not for 2 days, but for a week, and then a month. And now it's still wet 2 months later. The farmers have no place to relocate their livestock. The pens are nearly underwater. And even when it does come down for a time, you can see the silt left behind, and there's no way to go in and harvest. You can't get through. And even then, everyone is evacuated away from their homes. And the silt is the best thing for the soil. This is where it is richest, and next year's growth, provided the weather cooperates, will be fantastic. But what about this winter? So inflation begins, and it will just build as we realize how dynamic this change in weather has become, and how many nations, how many watersheds how many farms have been impacted and will just now begin to accept the degree to which the farmers will take nothing to market come September and October. And the United States is not immune to these kinds of disasters. During early spring of last year, the Missouri River suffered many levee breaches. The snowpack was good. It was great for the farmers, great for the watershed, but then it rained, and it rained some more. And the snow melted underneath the rain, and the ice jams began to move, and they broke up, and then they dammed the rivers, and then there was a flood. And then the Army Corps of Engineers had no choice but to break the levees, just as they did in China. And out the water went to flood the silos, to flood the farms, to flood the beef, the cattle yards, the stock yards, to flood the homes. It happened here last year. So many suffered because of those breaches, and we lost many stores of grain, vast stores of grain, some already off the farm and to the silos, to the docks, ready to be boarded upon the barges to be shipped overseas. But that didn't happen. It was lost in place. And then this week, just 2 days ago, a 15-minute storm, and then all of a sudden, all the year's crops lost. And via satellite imagery, you can see this lighter scarring when all the corn has simply been laid down. The silos opened up, and the grain spilled on the ground and rained on. Time and again, acre after acre, farmer after farmer, this was the story just 2 days ago. So how do you get ready for a harvest that may not come? Maybe you don't have a place to put it. Or maybe you'll get a little out of the ground, but still now you've got to deal with insurance. You've got to deal with neighbors to see what kind of storage they have. Or maybe the co-op down the way has room to store what little you can get out of the fields. And if it wasn't laid down, it was shredded. So then there's the whole other random event. World Food Program to send 50,000 tons of wheat flour to Lebanon after last week's blast destroyed its only silo with all the private stocks of grains held in that one single location. Literally in seconds, that nation's food supply of those grains was gone. So all solutions have to begin at the local level. And where I am 10 years in this house, and we hadn't planted a garden because there were enough in the community. But with COVID around and the Chinese flood, we just decided that it was time to bring things home. So we began to plant. We started bringing in soil. We turned the soil, and we seeded the things. And our elevation is high, but low enough, and we're far enough south, and gratefully we get a lot of sunshine, so we're able to realize a harvest. And the leafy greens always come in first. They're the simplest to grow. They're the least complex because you're not after seeds, you're just after the vegetation. So they've come in. The chard is in, the beets are in, and they continue to grow. And you can see there's some flowers in the background. So what was just shrub and weeds, we decided it was important to turn. And to be honest with you, I had a dream probably 2-3 years ago. There's actually 2 cedar trees here on this kind of the side of the picture that they were cut down, and all this was garden. So on Vicky's Coffee Break show 2-3 days ago, we talked about prophetic dreams, and this was one that I pulled out of the memory banks and said, all right, a couple of years ago, I saw this as garden, and that helped us move it forward. It's actually our neighbor's property. Here's the property line, and she agreed, and together we've been able to farm this little area. The bok choy's grown, coming up to maturity, and then a lot of weeds because it's never been watered before, so a lot of weeds have simply sprouted out. But something else we've done is to encourage the local flora to flourish. And so often all it takes is water. These provide flowers for the bees, and what are weeds to most have been and are nutritious and are now truly organic meals for us today. Bees and insects need this nectar for their food stores, and I so enjoy watching them do their invaluable daily busy work. First cup of coffee, I'll go out in the morning and watch it all just descend as the sun comes up, descend on what flowers and the nectar's been produced through those overnight hours. And it's just a part of the process that I have enjoyed. And so where we end up going is localizing, much like money and the big central banks, which are most prone to fail. And when they do fail, the failure is spectacular. And it's spectacular only because it is needed by so many. And when it fails spectacularly, it is all at once. Kind of like the Columbia when it went up, that shuttle, and it blew up in '86. It was spectacular and there was no recovery. The central banks will be a very similar story. So one of the ways to happen, and we're certainly not the only ones to realize this, is where community supported agriculture is headed. CSAs, and you find one near you and make friends. Make friends because friends help each other. Strangers are strangers. And until those relationships are cultivated and flourished because you're all working together, you're a stranger. And when in time of need, yes, strangers occasionally get help, but it's so much more important to have those relationships and those friendships ahead of time, because they will know and have worked out the details of what works, where you are, what is in season, what seeds work, what varieties work, and then also the appetites of the local areas. It's just that important. So, did you know that the Native Americans planted corn, beans, and squash together so that they would all benefit with each other? They had to have this beautifully synergistic relationship. The corn provides a structure for the beans to climb. The beans provide the nitrogen that refixes the soil that the other plants utilize, and the squash spreads along the ground, preventing the weeds. Very simple, three things, all with different vitamin and mineral ratios that you can use, and they all can be stored. The corn can be dried, the beans can be dried, and of course the squash are again a winter food. So it's those kind of things that won't spoil in your produce drawer that you'll want to be able to have the greatest access to. So CSA is going to be the answer, or one of the answers. But in the meanwhile, the question ultimately is, guys, are we there? Is this that time? Robin, that makes sense, but it wouldn't be a viable option because farmers are so far away. We've only got 1 to 2 crops here, potatoes and alfalfa, but what about variety? And that's where we are, because Robin and I are pretty much neighbors, is what was available before the white man showed up to introduce European crops and that way of living. So we go back to what would the natives have available to them, because they knew the crops, they knew what was available, what was poisonous, what was good for which purpose. And it's that kind of wisdom that isn't totally lost. And it's crazy how many kids, i.e. kids being under 20, under 30, that are aware and just driven to understand the ecosystem in their particular locations. And there's YouTubes that are full of this kind of wisdom as it is relearned, reshared, and ready to be learned by those that simply have the interest to know. Anyone need beef fat or chicken backs? Beef fat's always good here. Lard is what we're using instead of vegetable oil. We just have gone completely lard because it's just so much better for you. I remember when Mom started bringing home margarine. Oh my goodness. Now to learn that it's like one molecule off from paint, you're like, oh my goodness, I'll never touch that stuff again. So if anyone needs beef fat or chickens, hit Matthew Johnson up. He could probably get that in touch with you, or get in touch with you, or an exchange, because he runs the butcher department of our local grocery store. And it's always good to have locally sourced food, and Arm Mercantile is one of those that does their absolute best to do that. All right, guys, that's going to be it for the day and for the week for this particular show. We'll be back on Monday at 6 o'clock Mountain for another episode of another perspective. But food, I'm telling you, we're so close to simply a crisis situation. And once we realize what's happened with China and the number of people that are hungry, you're going to want to hit the food stores once again. And in a way, COVID was a good practice run. The training wheels are still on the bike. The supply chains are largely still up and running. Yes, they're stretched. In a few places we can see where they've been weakened. But this almost 6 months of lockdown in its various forms and so forth have really shown us where we have weaknesses and where we can redistribute what's available so we don't see so much waste going into the dump or just into the trash bin, because very few of us have animals in the backyard that we can feed our leftovers to. Yeah, great to have local food connections, Robin, and I appreciate you helping us getting our beef in the freezer, and then realizing that freezers are in such short supply. I saw a story today that if that Three Gorges Dam in China breaks, the economic damage in 1990, excuse me, in 2018 dollars will be upwards of $3.7 trillion, and 300,000 lives lost at a minimum. That's a lot of GDP. That's a lot of manufacturing that's going to come out of the system. So appliances that are built there in that zone that it contributes 15% of the global gross domestic product will just be taken offline, and who knows how long it'll be before those factories come up and are operating once again. And then they'll have to keep up or catch up with the demand for freezers, for refrigerators, for washers and dryers, for electric motors, all of those things that have been focused in China that are needed globally. All of that manufacturing needs to be redistributed back much, much closer to the population centers rather than concentrated in one particular location. It's just, in hindsight, we'll look at it as one of the greatest blunders of the 20th century is to outsource pharmaceuticals and that kind of manufacturing, because it ultimately, we don't realize you've made a mistake until it bites you in the butt. And that's what's happening today. All right, guys, thanks so much for stopping in. Good to see you there. And if you're in hashtag replay, then hey, hit hashtag replay and leave us a comment and suggestions for show topics, because we're always interested in those kind of things. All right, have a great evening, guys, and go have a really good meal.